Before we delve into tonight's story, a story that peels back the veneer of society to reveal a darkness so profound it will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about human nature. Make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. You won't want to miss the chilling tales we uncover here. Tonight, we explore a case that is as heartbreaking as it is horrifying. A mother, a child, and a $5 billion insurance policy that led to an unspeakable act. This is the brutal truth of a mother who killed her own child to cash in. The quiet, tree-lined street where Eleanor Vance lived with her 7-year-old son, Leo, was the picture of suburban tranquility. Immaculate lawns, freshly painted fences, and the distant laughter of children playing created a facade of perfect domesticity. Eleanor, a woman whose smile seemed permanently etched onto her face, was the envy of the neighborhood. Her home was a pristine example of modern architecture, her garden a riot of meticulously tended roses, and her son, Leo, a bright, bubbly boy with a mop of unruly blonde curls and a contagious giggle. To the outside world, their life was a storybook illustration of happiness. But behind the polished oak door of number 12, a different story was being written, one of secrets, desperation, and a darkness that was slowly, inexorably, taking root. Eleanor had not always been a resident of this affluent enclave. She had clawed her way up from a life of poverty, a childhood spent in a series of drab, soulless apartments, each one a stark reminder of what she was determined to escape. Her ambition was a raging fire within her, a relentless drive that had propelled her through a prestigious business school and into the cutthroat world of high finance. It was there she had met her husband, the late Marcus Vance, a man whose family name was synonymous with old money and immense power. Marcus had been captivated by Eleanor's beauty and fierce intelligence, and she, in turn, had been drawn to the security and status he represented. Their marriage had been a whirlwind of lavish parties, exotic vacations, and the birth of their son, Leo. But the fairy tale had ended abruptly with Marcus's sudden death in a yachting accident 2 years prior, leaving Eleanor a widow and a single mother. The inheritance, while substantial, had been a disappointment to Eleanor. Marcus, a man who had always been more of a romantic than a pragmatist, had left the bulk of his fortune to various charitable foundations, a final, posthumous act of altruism that had left his wife with a comfortable, but by her standards, modest settlement. It was enough to maintain the house and their lifestyle for a time, but it was not the generational wealth she had craved, the kind of money that would forever banish the ghosts of her impoverished past. And so, a new plan had begun to form in the recesses of her mind, a plan so audacious, so monstrous, that it defied all reason and morality. It had started with the insurance policy. Shortly after Leo's 5th birthday, Eleanor had taken out a life insurance policy on her son. Not a typical policy, the kind that parents take out to cover funeral expenses or to provide a small financial cushion in the event of a tragedy. This was a policy of a different magnitude altogether, a staggering $5 billion policy underwritten by a consortium of international insurers. The premiums were exorbitant, a significant drain on her dwindling resources, but Eleanor had been persuasive, charming the insurance brokers with her tales of a family trust that required such a policy for its sole heir. They had seen a wealthy, doting mother, a woman who would spare no expense to protect her child's future. They had not seen the cold, calculating mind that lay beneath the warm exterior. In the months leading up to that fateful autumn, a subtle shift occurred in the Vance household. The laughter that had once filled the spacious rooms grew a little quieter, the light in Leo's eyes a little dimmer. He had always been a boisterous child, full of energy and a mischievous sense of humor. But lately he had become more withdrawn, more prone to sudden bouts of anxiety. He would cling to his mother, his small hand clutching hers with a desperate intensity, as if he sensed a change in the very air he breathed. Eleanor, for her part, had become more solicitous, her displays of affection more pronounced, more theatrical. She would shower him with expensive gifts, smother him with kisses, and tell him, in a voice that was just a little too sweet, that he was her entire world. Dr. Alistair Finch, the family's pediatrician, had been the first to notice the change. He had known Leo since he was a baby, had watched him grow from a colicky infant into a rambunctious toddler. During a routine checkup, he had been struck by Leo's uncharacteristic listlessness. The boy who had once tried to dismantle his stethoscope with a gleeful shriek now sat passively on the examination table, his eyes downcast. Dr. Finch had also noted a series of minor, unexplained injuries: a bruised knee here, a scraped elbow there. Eleanor had dismissed them as the normal bumps and scrapes of an active boy, but something about her explanation had felt rehearsed, a little too smooth. He had made a note in Leo's file, a small seed of concern planted in the back of his mind. The neighbors, too, had started to whisper. Mrs. Gable from next door, a woman whose curtains twitched with every passing car, had commented on how often she saw Eleanor and Leo in the garden at odd hours of the night. She had seen them through her window, two small figures in the pale moonlight, Eleanor's arm wrapped tightly around her son's shoulders. It had seemed a tender moment at first, a mother and child sharing a secret under the stars. But there had been something unsettling about the stillness of the scene, the way they stood there for long stretches of time, as if in a trance. The narrative Eleanor was carefully constructing for the world was one of a devoted, slightly overprotective mother. She would speak of Leo's delicate health, his sensitive nature, his night terrors. She would confide in the other mothers at the school gate, her voice filled with a carefully calibrated mixture of concern and resignation. They had offered their sympathy, their advice, their casseroles. They had not seen the web of deceit she was spinning, each thread a carefully chosen word, each knot a subtle manipulation. The house itself seemed to hold its breath, the silence in its rooms growing heavier with each passing day. The nanny, a young woman named Clara, had been with the family since Leo was a baby. She had loved him like he was her own, had been his confidant, his playmate, his protector. But in the last few months, a wall had been erected between them, a wall built by Eleanor. Clara's duties had been curtailed, her time with Leo restricted. Eleanor had insisted on taking over all aspects of his care, from his meals to his bedtime stories. Clara had been relegated to the role of a glorified housekeeper, a silent observer in a house that no longer felt like a home. She had tried to talk to Eleanor, to express her concerns about Leo's changing behavior, but she had been met with a cold, dismissive stare, a warning to mind her own business. One evening, a week before the incident, Clara had been cleaning the upstairs hallway when she had overheard a heated phone conversation coming from Eleanor's study. The door had been ajar, and she had heard Eleanor's voice, sharp and laced with a venom she had never heard before. "The premiums are paid," Eleanor had hissed into the phone. "Everything is in place. You just need to do your part." There had been a pause, and then, "Don't you dare get cold feet now. There's too much at stake." Clara had hurried away, her heart pounding in her chest. She had not understood the full import of those words, but they had sent a chill down her spine. The day had started like any other. The sun had streamed through the large bay windows of the kitchen, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Eleanor had made pancakes, Leo's favorite, arranging them on his plate in the shape of a smiley face, a blueberry for each eye. He had picked at his food, his appetite gone, his small face pale and drawn. Eleanor had watched him, her own face a mask of maternal concern. She had kissed his forehead, her lips lingering a little too long, and had told him she had a surprise for him, a special adventure just for the two of them. Later that afternoon, they had gone for a walk in the woods that bordered their property. It was a place they had often explored together, a place of dappled sunlight and towering trees. But today, the woods had seemed different, the shadows deeper, the silence more profound. Leo had held his mother's hand, his small fingers intertwined with hers. He had looked up at her, his blue eyes wide with a question he could not articulate. Eleanor had smiled down at him, a smile that did not reach her eyes, and had led him deeper into the woods, towards a secluded spot by the river, a place where no one would see them, where no one would hear them. The air had grown heavy with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, the only sound the rustling of the wind through the trees, a mournful whisper that seemed to carry a premonition of the tragedy that was about to unfold. The stage was set, the players in their positions, and the final, terrible act of Eleanor Vance's meticulously crafted play was about to begin. The brutal truth, still hidden in the shadows, was waiting for its cue. The world would soon know the name of Eleanor Vance, not as a grieving mother, but as a monster in a mother's skin. The initial narrative that Eleanor Vance presented to the authorities was a masterclass in controlled hysteria. She was the picture of a devastated mother, her voice choked with sobs, her body racked with tremors, as she recounted the tragic accident that had claimed the life of her beloved son. Her story was simple, plausible, and utterly heartbreaking. They had been playing by the river, a game of hide and seek among the ancient, gnarled trees. Leo, in his youthful exuberance, had ventured too close to the water's edge, had slipped on a patch of moss-covered rocks, and had been swept away by the unexpectedly strong current. She had tried to save him. She had wailed, her clothes still damp, her hands raw and scratched from her frantic, futile attempts to pull him from the river's icy grasp. The search and rescue teams had been dispatched immediately, a swarm of uniformed figures combing the riverbanks, their boats cutting through the murky water, their diverse disappearing into its depths. For days, the community had held its breath, a collective prayer hanging in the air. Flyers with Leo's smiling face had been plastered on every lamppost, in every shop window. The local news had run nightly segments, featuring tearful interviews with a grief-stricken Eleanor, her face a mask of anguish, her words a poignant plea for her son's safe return. She had played the part of the grieving mother to perfection, her performance so convincing that it had elicited an outpouring of sympathy and support from friends, neighbors, and even strangers who had been touched by her story. But as the days turned into a week, and the search for Leo's body yielded nothing, a few dissenting voices began to emerge from the chorus of sympathy. Detective Miles Corbin, a man whose weary eyes had seen more than his fair share of human depravity, was one of them. He had been assigned to the case from the beginning, and while he had initially been inclined to believe Eleanor's story, a small, persistent voice in the back of his mind had whispered that something was not right. It was in the details, the small inconsistencies, the moments when Eleanor's grief had seemed a little too theatrical, a little too well rehearsed. He had noticed the way her tears had never quite reached her eyes, the way her hands, though she had claimed to have clawed at the riverbank, were immaculately manicured. Corbin had started digging, quietly at first, a discreet inquiry into Eleanor Vance's background. He had discovered the massive life insurance policy, a fact that had sent a jolt of alarm through him. $5 billion. It was an astronomical sum, a figure that defied belief. He had also spoken to Dr. Finch, who had shared his concerns about Leo's recent health and the unexplained injuries. He had interviewed the nanny, Clara, who had recounted the overheard phone conversation, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and guilt. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together, and the picture they were forming was a chilling one. The discovery of Leo's body, a week after his disappearance, had been the turning point in the investigation. It had been found not in the river, but in a shallow grave in a remote, wooded area several miles from the Vance home. The cause of death was not drowning, but a lethal dose of a fast-acting sedative, a drug that had been prescribed to Eleanor for her anxiety. The official narrative of a tragic accident had crumbled, and Eleanor Vance had gone from a grieving mother to the prime suspect in her son's murder. The trial that followed was a media sensation, a spectacle of courtroom drama that had captivated the nation. The prosecution, led by a sharp, incisive district attorney named Maria Rodriguez, had methodically dismantled Eleanor's carefully constructed facade. They had presented the evidence, piece by damning piece. The insurance policy, the apathetic mother's purchase of the sedative, and Clara's testimony about the overheard phone call. They had painted a portrait of a cold, calculating woman, a woman who had seen her own child not as a son to be loved and cherished, but as a pawn in a twisted, monstrous game. Eleanor's defense team, a high-powered group of lawyers paid for by the remnants of her late husband's fortune, had fought back with equal ferocity. They had portrayed her as a loving mother, a woman driven to the brink of despair by the loss of her child, a victim of a biased investigation and a sensationalist media. They had argued that the sedative had been planted, that the insurance policy was a misunderstanding, that Clara's testimony was the vindictive rambling of a disgruntled employee. The courtroom had become a battleground, a stage where two competing narratives had clashed. But it was Eleanor's own performance on the stand that had ultimately sealed her fate. She had been calm, composed, her answers to the prosecutor's questions delivered in a smooth, even tone. She had wept at all the right moments, her voice breaking with emotion as she had spoken of her love for Leo. But there had been a hollowness to her words, a lack of genuine emotion that had not gone unnoticed by the jury. Her eyes, which had so convincingly feigned grief for the television cameras, were now cold and empty, a chilling window into the darkness that resided within her. In the end, the jury had seen through the act. They had seen the monster that lurked beneath the polished exterior, the woman who had sacrificed her own child on the altar of her insatiable greed. The verdict had been swift and unanimous. Guilty of first-degree murder. The judge, his voice heavy with a mixture of sorrow and disgust, had sentenced her to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The $5 billion insurance policy, the prize for which she had committed the ultimate sin, would never be claimed. The years that followed the trial saw the name of Eleanor Vance fade from the headlines, her story relegated to the annals of true crime history. The quiet, tree-lined street where she had once lived had moved on, the memory of the tragedy a faint, unpleasant echo in the minds of its residents. The house at number 12 had been sold, its pristine rooms now filled with the laughter of a new family, a family untainted by the darkness of its past. But for those who had been touched by the case, the scars remained, a permanent reminder of the evil that can lurk in the most unexpected of places. Detective Corbin, the man who had first seen through Eleanor's web of deceit, had retired from the force, the weight of the Vance case having taken its toll on his weary soul. He had seen the worst of humanity, but the image of Leo's small, innocent face, a face that had been so cruelly extinguished, would forever haunt his dreams. He would sometimes visit the boy's grave, a small, unassuming headstone in a quiet corner of the local cemetery, and would stand there in silence, a silent testament to the life that had been so tragically cut short. Clara, the nanny, had left the country, unable to escape the guilt that had consumed her. She had replayed that overheard phone conversation 1,000 times in her mind, had tortured herself with the what-ifs and the if-onlys. She had known, in her heart, that something was terribly wrong, but she had been too afraid to speak up, too intimidated by Eleanor's cold, commanding presence. The knowledge that she could have done more, that she could have saved Leo, was a burden she would carry for the rest of her life. And what of Eleanor? The woman who had once been the epitome of grace and sophistication now resided in a world of concrete and steel, her days a monotonous cycle of routine and regret. The designer clothes had been replaced by a drab prison uniform, the lavish parties by the clang of cell doors. The face that had once graced the society pages was now etched with the lines of bitterness and despair. She had lost everything: her son, her freedom, her very soul. In the sterile, unforgiving environment of the prison, stripped of her wealth and her power, Eleanor was forced to confront the true nature of her crime. The nights were the worst, the long, silent hours when the ghosts of her past would come to visit. She would see Leo's face in the darkness, his blue eyes filled with a mixture of love and confusion. She would hear his laughter echoing in the silence of her cell, a sound that was both a cherished memory and a source of unbearable pain. There were moments, fleeting and far between, when a flicker of remorse would penetrate the thick walls of her narcissism. She would remember a small, warm hand in hers, a sleepy head on her shoulder, the unconditional love of a child for his mother. In those moments, the full weight of what she had done would crash down on her, a wave of grief so profound that it would leave her gasping for breath. But those moments were rare. For the most part, she remained trapped in a prison of her own making, a prisoner of her own insatiable greed, a woman who had traded her son's life for a fortune she would never possess. The story of Eleanor Vance serves as a chilling reminder that evil can wear a beautiful mask, that the most monstrous of acts can be committed by the most unlikely of people. It is a story of a mother's love twisted into a grotesque parody of itself. A story of a life cut short by the very person who should have been its fiercest protector. And as we reflect on this brutal truth, we are left with a single, haunting question. What darkness lies dormant in the human heart, waiting for the right moment to be unleashed? The house on the tree-lined street still stands, a silent witness to the tragedy that unfolded within its walls. The roses in the garden still bloom, their vibrant colors a stark contrast to the darkness that once resided there. And in a quiet corner of the local cemetery, a small headstone bears the name of a little boy who was loved by many, but betrayed by the one person who should have loved him most. His story, a heartbreaking tale of innocence lost and a mother's unthinkable crime, will not soon be forgotten. It is a story that will be told and retold, a cautionary tale whispered in the hushed tones of a dark and stormy night, a brutal truth uncovered for all to see. 2 decades is an eternity in the gray, monotonous world of the Oak Haven Maximum Security Correctional Facility for women. It is long enough for youth to wither into old age, for vibrant memories to fade into washed-out photographs of a life that no longer exists. For inmate 734, formerly known as Eleanor Vance, it was a slow, grinding erosion of everything she had once been. The flawless skin was now a roadmap of wrinkles, the once fiery ambition had cooled to a hard, brittle resentment, and the name that had once commanded respect in boardrooms now only elicited whispers of revulsion in the prison yard. Eleanor was dying. The cancer that had started as a whisper in her lungs was now a roar, consuming her from the inside out. The prison infirmary, with its sterile smell and indifferent staff, was her final stage. Propped up against thin pillows, she looked like a fragile, bird-like creature, a pale imitation of the formidable woman she had once been. But her eyes, though sunken, still held a flicker of the old, cold fire. It was the look of a predator trapped in a failing body, a mind that still schemed and calculated even as her world shrank to the 4 walls of her room. Knowing the end was near, she had made a final, unusual request. She wanted to see him, not a priest, not a lawyer, but the man who had put her here. She wanted to see retired Detective Miles Corbin. Corbin was in his late 70s now, a man whose life was a quiet routine of gardening and spending time with his grandchildren. The Vance case, the defining moment of his career, was a ghost he had long since made peace with. When the warden's call came, his initial reaction was to refuse. Why dredge up the past? What could she possibly have to say to him after all these years? But a deeper, more compelling emotion took hold: curiosity, and a sense of duty to the small boy who had never had the chance to grow old. He owed it to Leo to see this through to the very end. He found her looking smaller and more pathetic than he had ever imagined. The power suit and pearls were replaced by a threadbare hospital gown. The confident posture was gone, replaced by the slumped shoulders of a woman defeated by time and disease. He sat in the plastic chair by her bed, the silence between them thick with unspoken history. "You came," she finally rasped, her voice a dry rustle of leaves. "I came," Corbin confirmed, his voice steady. "Why did you want to see me, Eleanor?" A faint, mirthless smile touched her lips. "I thought you'd want to be here for the final act. You were always so invested in my story." "It was never your story I was invested in," he said quietly. "It was Leo's." The mention of his name did not cause a flicker of emotion on her face. It was as if he were talking about a stranger. "He would have been 27 now," she mused, her gaze distant. "Probably married. A child of his own, perhaps. A doctor or a lawyer. He was so bright." "You took all that away," Corbin stated, not as an accusation, but as a simple, undeniable fact. "Did I?" she countered, a spark of defiance in her eyes. "Or did a world that values wealth above all else take it away? I was a product of my environment, detective. I learned the rules of the game. I just played it better than anyone else." Corbin shook his head slowly. "That's the story you tell yourself to sleep at night. But we both know the truth. You had a choice. Every day you had a choice." She coughed, a racking, painful sound that shook her frail frame. When she caught her breath, She looked at him, her expression shifting into one of mock confidentiality. "Do you want to know my biggest regret, detective? After all these years, I've had a lot of time to think. I've pinpointed the exact moment it all went wrong." Corbin leaned forward, despite himself. Was this it? A deathbed confession? A moment of true remorse that might offer some sliver of redemption? Some sense of peace for the soul of the child she had murdered? Eleanor's eyes locked onto his. "My regret," she whispered, the words dripping with a venom that illness had not diluted, "is that I ever told the nanny she could take Tuesdays off. If she had been there, I would have had a perfect alibi. I was sloppy. That was my only mistake." The sheer, unadulterated narcissism of the statement hit Corbin like a physical blow. There was no remorse, no guilt, only the frustration of a failed strategist, a master manipulator lamenting a single tactical error. In that moment, he saw her not as a dying old woman, but as the monster she had always been, a void where a human soul should have been. He stood up, the legs of the chair scraping against the linoleum floor. There was nothing more to say. He had come seeking closure, and in a way he had found it. The final, brutal truth was that Eleanor Vance was incapable of redemption. "Goodbye, Eleanor," he said, his voice flat. He turned and walked out of the room without looking back, leaving her alone with her bitterness and her disease. As he walked out of the prison gates and into the sunlight, Corbin felt a profound sense of release. The ghost of Leo Vance, the small boy he had fought so hard for, was finally at peace. The story was over. Eleanor Vance died 3 days later, alone in the sterile infirmary room. Her death was a minor news item, a brief mention on page 12 of the local paper, a footnote in a story that had once gripped a nation. The $5 billion insurance policy, the catalyst for so much pain and destruction, remained in a perpetual state of legal limbo, an obscene sum of money that was a testament to a mother's greed and the ultimate futility of her crime. The brutal truth, now fully uncovered, was not just that a mother had killed her child, but that, in the end, she had gained nothing and lost the one thing that should have been priceless: her own humanity. The death of an inmate, even one as notorious as Eleanor Vance, rarely makes a ripple beyond the prison's concrete walls. It is a file closed, a bunk cleared for the next soul. But Eleanor had left behind a unique and troublesome ghost, a $5 billion financial time bomb. For decades, the insurance policy had been trapped in a legal quagmire. The underwriters had fought viciously against paying it out, invoking the Slayer rule, a long-standing legal principle that prevents a murderer from profiting from their crime. Since Eleanor was the perpetrator, she and her estate were ineligible. But the policy itself remained a binding document. The question that hung in the stale air of courtrooms and law offices was, if not Eleanor, then who? The case had become a legend in legal circles, nicknamed the Vance inheritance. It was passed from senior partner to senior partner, a complex, distasteful mess that no one truly wanted to solve. It finally landed on the desk of Evelyn Reed, a young, sharp, and ferociously ambitious associate in the trusts and estates department of a prestigious law firm. To her, it wasn't a burden. It was an opportunity. She saw, through the dust of 2 decades of litigation, a unique challenge to solve the unsolvable. Evelyn immersed herself in the history of the Vance family. She read every trial transcript, every newspaper article, every financial document. She mapped out a family tree, tracing the branches of both the Vance lineage and Eleanor's own family. Eleanor's side was a dead end. She was an only child of long-dead parents with no known relatives. So, Evelyn focused on Marcus Vance, the late husband and Leo's father. He came from old money, but he had been an idealist who had funneled much of the family fortune into charitable foundations before his death, an act that had infuriated Eleanor. For weeks, Evelyn hit brick walls. The trail was cold, the people involved long dead or moved on, but her persistence paid off. Buried deep within an old, archived trust document, she found a name no one had ever seriously considered: Sarah Vance, Marcus's younger sister. She had been disowned by the family years before Marcus had even met Eleanor. The reason? She had rejected their life of opulent wealth, calling it morally vacant, and had dedicated her life to social work instead. She had cut all ties, vanished from the high society circles, and was considered, for all intents and purposes, dead to the family. Finding Sarah Vance was like searching for a phantom. There was no address, no phone number, no social media footprint. But Evelyn uncovered one small detail. Sarah was a talented artist. Following that single, fragile thread, Evelyn searched through small art communities, obscure co-ops, and finally, she found her. Sarah Vance was living in a small, modest home in a quiet coastal town, hundreds of miles and a world away from the life she had left behind. She was in her 70s now, a woman with a shock of silver hair and kind, clear eyes that spoke of a life lived with simplicity and purpose. She ran a small, underfunded community center that provided art classes, hot meals, and a safe haven for the area's struggling children. When Evelyn Reed appeared on her doorstep, with her tailored business suit and leather briefcase, Sarah was confused. When Evelyn explained why she was there, the confusion turned to disbelief, and then to a deep, visceral horror. She knew about Eleanor and the tragedy of the nephew she had never been allowed to meet. She had followed the trial from afar, her heart breaking for the boy and recoiling in disgust from the woman her brother had married. $5 billion? Sarah whispered, the words sounding alien and obscene on her tongue. For Leo. No, I don't want it. It's blood money. Ms. Vance, Evelyn said gently. Legally, as Leo was the beneficiary and you are his only surviving blood relative, the inheritance defaults to you. The insurance companies have exhausted their appeals. The money must be paid. Then let it rot in a bank, Sarah said, her eyes flashing with a fierce integrity. I will not have a single cent of that money stain my life or the work I do here. It's a curse. Evelyn had anticipated this. I understand, she said. But think of it this way. Eleanor Vance committed an act of unimaginable evil out of greed. She turned your nephew's life into a number on a balance sheet. If that money sits unused, then her evil, in a way, wins. It remains a monument to her greed and nothing more. Evelyn paused, letting her words sink in. But what if you take it? What if you take this symbol of ultimate greed and turn it into a symbol of ultimate hope? Think of what you could do for this center. For these children, you could build a legacy for Leo. A legacy not about how he died, but about the thousands of lives that were helped in his name. Don't let Eleanor's final act be the one that defines everything. Let yours. Over the next few days, Sarah wrestled with the decision. The thought of touching the money repulsed her. But Evelyn's words, and more importantly, the faces of the children who came to her center every day with worn-out shoes and hungry bellies, replayed in her mind. Finally, she made her choice. 1 year later, the Leo Vance Foundation for Children was established. With an endowment of $5 billion, it instantly became one of the largest child-focused charities in the world. It built state-of-the-art schools in underprivileged areas, funded cutting-edge pediatric hospitals, and established safe houses for abused and neglected children. Sarah's small community center became its global headquarters, a beautiful, light-filled building where the laughter of children now echoed through the halls. The Vance name, once synonymous with a monstrous crime, was now attached to philanthropy and hope. In a final, profound irony of fate, Eleanor Vance's evil plan to enrich herself had, in the end, enriched the lives of countless children she would never know. The final brutal truth to be uncovered was not about the depths of one woman's depravity, but about the incredible capacity for good to spring from the most poisoned soil. The money bought with the blood of an innocent child had been cleansed by the waters of compassion and reborn as a legacy of love. And in that way, the short life of Leo Vance, extinguished by greed, was given a meaning that reached far beyond anything his killer could have ever imagined. He was not just remembered, he had become a beacon,